Hello, everybody. I'm Stacie Widdifield, and I am going to give you um, a basic lecture on some of the art at the mission San Javier del Bac. So this is San Javier del Bac in art historical context for your NEH landmarks, Arizona-Sonora, Borderlands, Palimpsest of cultures. Okay. So let's start here. I want to start here looking at a few questions, and I want to start actually with a quote from a very, very important scholar on San Javier. She's an art historian, and a number of the scholars who have worked on San Javier have come from different disciplines. So this is really, it gives us the art historical sort of take on things, and I rely a great deal on her really important research here. And you've been given that article. So one of the things you can kind of keep in mind is that you can also go back into that article, which is very dense. And I certainly have not committed to memory all of the details there, but you'll be able to sort of use this PowerPoint to help you through that article as well to get more info out of it. So with this first quote, Bach has been a site of negotiation among many parties, and there are an infinite number of aspects still to be investigated at each point in its history. So we have negotiation, we have many parties, and we have point in history. That means many people and with a very long chronology. And that's to give the broader framework here. And as I said, her article will sort of explain to you how she sort of came to this conclusion. But this is the reference here, so you want to keep that in mind too. Okay, so now the way I've organized this PowerPoint is to kind of give you some key points about what you're looking at, some images, and then at the bottom here you see these blue, green, and red questions. Each one starts with a question mark, and that's just to suggest to you that you might think about using that as a question in your own classrooms. How many lives does San Javier del Bac have? There's the end of the 17th century, there's the 18th century, there's the 19th century, the 20th century, and with all of the different groups of people who have interacted with it. So that's really important to keep in mind. And what about San Javier del Bac in the public imagination? We live in this moment, and certainly our students do, which is highly inflected by their ability to get information on any one of the different platforms that is image serving to the public. So you could send them out to Instagram or Facebook or maybe TikTok. I haven't checked to see yet if there are videos about it, but you never know, or Flickr, for example. And have them, look through these things. This, for example, is the first screen of an image returned from Google. And one of the things you can think about here is, what do people always photograph? What do we know about it from this collection of images? Is it always going to be the facade with the two towers? How many images do we get that show us the side or the interior, things like that? So these digital platforms are really, they can contribute, in fact, to the sort of a single view, or it's kind of a dominant view of the way we understand particular images. So that might be a fun exercise to see who has put what up online. And then the third question is to look at the official website of San Javier and see what they say. They are the knowledge keepers, and see what was very important to them. And this gives an opportunity to talk to students about, who does the collecting of this information and where does it go. Okay, so I want to start by giving you some framework for thinking about this really complicated space. It's beautiful and it's just wondrous as you move through it. So I like to think of this as spaces which are symbolic and performative, and that have plans that you can follow and then paths that people move through. So the first plan we can think of is the architectural one. We see it's built around a rectangularly shaped or longitudinally oriented space that's rectangular. Here, the nave, and here's the facade. This is where you would enter the main door. You move through this nave and you see there's the high altar here, and you notice that there is an area that crosses over that. That's the crossing or the transept. So you have a variety of different spaces here, and that very simple form of the rectangle going vertically and then the rectangle going the opposite direction, you can think of that as really an essentialized form of a human figure. And it's also a centralized form, of course, of Christ and Christ crucified. So the symbolism of what this space is about is built literally into the floor plan. The other way to think about a plan is in terms of what I think is probably a really nice way to encourage your students to think about this is as suites of images, groups of images. This isn't just a scattering of objects all over the complex spaces of this building. They each have a program, they have an integrity to them. And so I think that's a key point that one can share. So the suites of images will be on the facade, they'll be on the nave walls, they'll be in the high altar, and then in the chapels. And then paths. So how do people typically move through this space? Well, the primary one, of course, would be the path that's created by the structure of the Catholic Mass. And it would be sort of the point of two groups. One would be the celebrant up here in the sanctuary in the altar table, who would be looking out here to the congregation, and the congregation's looking in the opposite direction. So the emphasis is, of course, here on the high altar. The other way to think about paths is people who are part of the parish here, or even visitors, individuals or families, and even across generations who come to this space on their own, separate from the Mass, who may go to the chapel or up to the rail here in front of the high altar and offer prayers, offerings, light candles to specific saints. So that's their path, okay? So this gives you some sense of the kind of complexity of movement and performance as in movement through this organized space. The other path to think about is that we know that some of the statues that you will see, sculptures of saints, which are dressed, and they are on different feast days processed through the church. So that's something else, so that the art moves. You can think of it like that. And then finally, one of the ways that it's hard for us coming from the outside and looking in, not to sort of think of this as kind of intellectually in the same way you might a museum, walls where things are on it, are hung on it, as a research kind of space. So you might want to kind of keep in mind the sort of vitality of all of these different things working at work as you move through the church. Another way to think of paths, these sort of artistic paths, is issues that are very, very important now for art history and culture, which are, I'm thinking about what is global and what is mobile, okay? So in this case, we know that there were multiple artists who worked on this structure, on the building, on the objects, and some of them were trained in Mexico City and came up. Some of them were local. There were works which are created here at San Javier del Bac, and others which were imported from way away from Mexico City. And by the way, this CDMX is the Spanish acronym for Mexico City. And then we have another way to think about that too, which we know is that there were already from a sort of previous version of the church, reusing sculptures from that and bringing them here into the church, the space that we are pretty much familiar with now. Okay, so let's look at some of the image suites. And again, this is very abbreviated. It's just to give you some kind of highlights to look at and help you sort of move through the space when you have the opportunity to go in the church. So we're going to look at examples here of the facade with sculptures in niches, right? Relief sculptures, the nave that's here with murals or wall paintings, the high altar or retablo with sculptures and niches, and then the side chapels also with sculptures and niches and murals. And at the same time, we have decorative painting that will be especially along the walls and up towards the ceiling and on the ceiling that then link objects within these image suites and then link one image suite in a sense to the next. The other thing I just want to alert you to is that this, as you know from the information that you have already gotten, was originally a Jesuit church and then was taken over. And when the Jesuits were told to leave New Spain in 1767, the Franciscans took over. So it's a church that kind of negotiates between those two groups. So we have images that represent the Jesuits, especially San Francisco Xavier, San Javier del Bac, that's the patron saint, or the Franciscan saint, for example, Saint Francis of Assisi. And here I wanted to kind of really, when you go through the church, be sure and kind of take time to stop and look. It is really just amazing if you just take a few moments to really look at how the images are made, where they're located, what's located next to them, the scale of these images, materials of these images. You will see what a really remarkable place it is. And all of these things were planned to kind of work together and express the needs of what originally were the Jesuits and then the Franciscans in relationship to their parishioners. Okay, the other thing I wanted to mention is if we take the whole church, the whole entire church, the exterior and the interior, that is a kind of super suite, okay? What we have is the Franciscan cord. This is the cord that you would see Franciscans even today, the rough hewn sort of cord tied around their waist. And that appears on the exterior where this red line is. So you'll see that when you go on the facade. And when you go inside, you'll see it all the way down the nave wall, all the way here until it kind of turns the corner and finishes with the tassels at the end, right around in the retablo behind the high altar around the figure of San Francisco Javier. So it emphasizes the Franciscan order in the building of the church and its historical role in the organization of the church community. And so you may have students who are familiar with this iconography, these symbols, or these spaces. So, you know, it's a great opportunity to ask them what they bring to your lesson and what it is that they may be familiar with. Okay, let's start at the facade. And the facade is both architecture and sculpture. It's basically kind of brick with plaster. The sculptures are going to have wood and probably in some cases wood, but mostly brick with plaster on the top and then paint. And it's organized very similarly to the kinds of plans that would have been made for these facades of Jesuit churches in the 18th century in Mexico, in and around Mexico City. So here we have San Javier way far away from Mexico City, but the sort of the kind of organization, the spatial and symbolic organization is something that you see here, and it links those two spaces, right? And so what we have here, you can see, this is like a screen, okay? It's like a screen that in a sense separates the outside and the inside, but also kind of separates more secular space from a more sacred space, okay? It doesn't mean that the clerics would not necessarily, we would have at some point given, done mass, etc., from the second floor right here, this balcony. So it's probably a little bit too, simplistic to say secular and sacred, but you can see it's the facade is telling you, okay, there's something else going on the inside. This is really important because the facade, what's on the facade here, kind of gives you cues, okay, about what's going to happen in the retablo. It kind of begins to orient you and tell you maybe what could you expect to see there. And we know that absolutely was a principle in 18th century churches in Mexico City. You can see it's very symmetrical. If you drew a line from here to here, you can see everything is basically the same on either side of that line. And we have multiple stories, right? So this is, very tall. And we have we have sort of key elements here. If you see 1, 2, 3, 4, these are niches with these brick plastered colored statues. They're on platforms here, a plinth, and they have a niche around them. And each of them is covered by this beautiful rendering of a swag, okay, cloth, but it's made out of brick and plaster with paint on it. And what's really interesting about this facade is its program, its symbolic program, required the presentation of 4 female saints. And this is fairly unusual. Scholars, Umberger and others, have debated about exactly who they are, but they are probably 4 early female martyrs of the church. Again, you can go into her article for more details about that. So that's quite remarkable. We also have up here what the sort of most recent argument, there seems to be a strong case to be made that this figure, which is quite damaged, was right here, what's left of it, was a figure of St. Francis of Assisi, who would be the patron saint, on the outside, because it's a Franciscan church. Then we go inside and you'll see it's San Francisco Xavier. That's almost in the exact location. And then below it, we have a shield, which frames what is a kind of a symbolic version of the Franciscans, which is a representation of the stigmata of Christ, the wounds of Christ. Each of the orders had their patron saint, and then they had an emblem that could kind of substitute for their identity. You could use it in a variety of different image contexts. Then we also have sort of vegetal decorative motifs here, all done again in brick with plaster on it and paint. And that's a very common thing to fill it in. But, typically when you see vegetal motifs and flowers and things, that can refer to the Garden of Eden, multiple kinds of things. So what looks to be sort of decoration can often have more significance. Oh, and here again, this is where the court is, right here. Okay. Let's see, the other thing is, yes, I said that the retablo here can kind of help us predict what's going to be in the inside. One other element, these elements right here, these architectural elements, they're not separate from the church. They're not, there's no space behind it. They're like pilasters, or engaged columns. They're actually part of that facade. Which you can see them here. These are really important objects. They're called estipites. They're a very key architectural feature in 18th century facades of churches in and around Mexico City. So again, this is a really crucial idea. This is a typical plan of a church, which is very similar in many ways to what you see at San Xavier. Details can change. Towers, facade, dome, nave, etc., transept, apse, all of those things. You turn this around, you would enter here, and then you would move across what you can see in this diagram. The other thing I wanted you to notice too here in terms of imagery is the contrast between the white towers and the sort of reddish brown, and of course when it had its paint, even more contrast. But this is a period in which that kind of decoration was extremely important, and it was meant to look sculptural, to sort of take advantage of the play of daylight over these reliefs. You can see this very clearly in this photo here, and it makes things look almost as if they're kind of moving, and space where it goes in and it comes out. So it's extremely, extremely dynamic. It's nothing like the sort of flat facade of this tower, for example. So this was very important, high and low, flat and decorated, painted or not painted. And this is an opportunity to think about what's the effect of all of this on the viewer. It was really something that could overwhelm and say, this, to simplify things greatly, this is a really important and special space. Here is just a detail of that, the estipite, sorry about that. And estipite, and the SXB, by the way, is my abbreviation for San Xavier del Bac. Here you can see is a drawing of the estipite. And this, we're looking at one of the most important structures of the 18th century, was built in the 1730s by a Spanish architect, is the high altar, the new high altar of the main cathedral of Mexico City, okay? The altar of the kings. And you can see it's like this cave, right? Keep that space in mind when we look at our chapels here at San Xavier. Here are the estipites. They're not structural. You can't put anything on them. They're decorative. They're inverted columns, but you have sculptures that are placed in and around them. So this really gives you a sense of, and this is immensely tall. It's, again, it's like something, multiple stories, okay, in the way that Xavier is. All right, so now if we go through the facade, through the main doors into the nave, okay, this is the kind of simplest part of the church. Look here at a mural, and just to remind you, murals, right? Wall paintings, of course. This, if you wondered about this, you can say with absolute certainty that Diego Rivera did not invent mural painting. Okay, so this was very, very important church decorations from the 16th century on in what we know of as New Spain, which of course is now Mexico. And both, there's a mural here, the Last Supper, and one of the Pentecost. I'm just going to show you the Last Supper, and both of them deal with the apostles. Okay, and that you extend that story out to the idea of missionizing. Okay. So here's and this is painted again on the wall. It's two-dimensional because it's paint on the wall. And you can see how it's constructed here. You have a painted frame with a painted stand, and the curtains, you see the red curtains here drawn back to let us see the drama of the Last Supper. And that's a very Baroque kind of device, the drama, the theater behind those curtains. And one of the things you'll notice is you keep in mind, almost everywhere you look at Xavier are representations of cloth and textiles surrounding statues, in this case, inside of the scene of the Last Supper. That's an interesting idea too. If your students have seen Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper, you can talk to them about a kind of comparison there. And so remember, we move through here, and this is what you would see as you go up the nave. So keep in mind, this is a kind of spatial odyssey here. Then the next thing we would see is the retablo behind the high altar. Here's the high altar. Okay, so we're right here. The A here, these stand for apostles. 9 and 10 is the Virgin of the Immaculate Conception, and below is the statue of San Francisco Xavier, the patron saint originally, San Javier del Bois. So all of this sits behind the altar table. It's the absolute focus of the church, okay? So, and a retablo is you can think of it as kind of an altar screen. It's a sort of multimedia construction with architecture, sculpture, and very often paintings. So it's quite elaborate. And when, mere mortals are standing in front of it, again, you have to imagine, what is it like to look up to the top of this, where you would see very typically the Trinity, and here the case of the figure of God. So we have the patron saint here in the key center of the retablo with various apostles around. So again, it's a program. All of these are organized according to very standard kinds of procedures for explaining the relationship of the particular order, okay, that's involved with the church, Franciscan or Jesuit. Hence the, in this case, the San Francisco Xavier. So they're parts of, and that's a really important idea. This isn't haphazard. People just didn't guess. There were sort of rules for how you could make all of this work together. So again, thinking about going from the facade into the church and now looking at the high altar, how would you describe that? You can see things that are typically associated with the Baroque, especially Spanish Baroque, the emphasis on color, on a variety of materials, on visual movement, on volume and depth, on surfaces. So the materiality here is extremely important. It's this idea of surprises almost where you look. You have to look into this to see that saint, look around this, that this is overwhelming. And the idea here is actually to think about this as transporting you out of this world into this kind of celestial world. And of course, the celebrant of the Mass would have all of this to his back, for the most part, looking out towards the congregation in the nave. Are a few details here. The materials, this is gilding, which is gold leaf that's very, very carefully sort of adhered with a brush It's incredibly difficult to do that. And here you can see up close the astipites that I talked about. These are all have, you can see the relief decoration on it. So it's not just a flat surface. It's very, very elaborate. But you also have around it here, to the right is an example of silver leaf that had these beautiful colored glazes on the top. So when you go in there, what you see is that this glows. It's a really remarkable effect. And it looks lustrous and it looks expensive. And it's this idea, again, of creating a kind of heavenly and celestial sphere right there in front of you. The other thing you might want to think about too is, what does this, the retablo that we just saw, share with the facade? Look what we have here, the Franciscan cord. You can see it really carefully here. And of course, the astipites right here, okay. This is an example of a church. It's a Jesuit complex outside of Mexico City, called Tepoztlán. It is really, it's one of the best examples I think I can give you to show you the sort of ideas that San Javier borrows for its church design. And when you walk in here, you feel like you've got to hold on to something, because you're sure this whole wall is moving, right? And you can see it's much wider than the San Javier one, but you can see the astipites here. You can see San Javier here. So it's the same set of principles, right? It's dazzling, it's encrusted, the surfaces are activated. This is not something that just sits still, like, 2 dimensions on a wall. And then up above it, typical of what we also see at San Javier, is floral decorations, other saints and apostles painted up above in murals, and then a dome's very typical. Let's say this light, it sort of increases the idea of the spectacle. Niches with statues in it. And if we go to the facade, you can see it's much more elaborate than the one at San Javier. It's stone. Nevertheless, it's the same kind of principle. You see the multiple stories here, right, with the astipites, and then the niches, which have the different figures that are associated with the religious symbolic program of San Javier at Tepoztlán. Now, just a kind of a quick look at the image of the patron saint, San Francisco Javier, who's right here. You can see in his niche, right? You can also see it's painted frame, painted flowers around it. And if we go look at a few more details, one of the things that's really important when I talked about pathways, is the processional pathway, okay? And that moves statues out from their niches, okay, down the church, and in some cases outside. So this is a statue. It's clothed in real clothes, okay, or real vestments, right, clerical vestments. And you can actually see the difference between this photograph and this one. You can see details here. The colors of the garments have changed, so that this is a different time of year for a different liturgical moment. So somebody dresses these figures, and groups dress them, and groups take care of these figures and take care of the garments. So it's a very, very important kind of sacred responsibility to do that. If you look at this photograph, you can see it's a wooden statue that is closed, okay, and then can be processed. And this is the case in a couple of the other statues as well, whereas you have a figure like this, one of the apostles, who is a wooden figure, which is then covered with plaster, and also cloth, which is kind of stiffened with a sort of plaster and then painted, okay? And this is, again, another good example of the variety of materials. When you get up close to it, you'll have to say to yourself, where do I look? Okay, how do I, kind of follow along with all of that? The other thing I want to remind you again is that when we're standing on the floor, everything's up above us, or most of it, certainly the high altar. And remember, that's a kind of, that reinforces a notion of devotion, right, of looking up at something rather than either looking down or directly across. So space and objects and materiality, all of these things work together symbolically in a religious sense and an artistic sense. Okay, and here I wanted to show you examples of paintings that are made in the 18th century that show us the processing of religious images in the community, their communities. Here you can see this is a statue of the Virgin. You notice she's on a plinth here. You could take her and put her right next to the facade of Saint-Xavier with those 4 martyrs, right? And it's another version of that. So you see, and here's another version here, one of the doctors of the church that are being processed in the town of Puebla, which is to the east of Mexico City. And then here is a really interesting one. It's an enormous procession that's moving. It's moving the image of the Virgin of Guadalupe to her new basilica. So art moves. So we go into this something like Saint-Xavier and we think everything's in its place and this is where it stays. But this idea of processing something and the people in the church processing with it is a really important idea, not only in religious sense, but it's also a way, as you can see from these paintings, it's a place that people could see art, okay? They didn't have museums as the way we have them now, but where did the community see images? Okay, then to the chapels. These are very complicated, and they're right here and here, okay? We're looking at this as if it's the left and the right, but in fact, you have to think of them as from the opposite point of view. There are these concave spaces with murals and decorative painting and sculptures, but it's from the point of view of the mass celebrant that they are organized. So you have to reverse what you're seeing there. So this is called the gospel side, which shows us Christ and St. Francis and another figure, Saint-Xavier here, murals here. And it's called the gospel side because that's where the reading of the gospel would take place. It's the male side, and you go across here is the epistle side with Mary, okay? And so the gospels were written first, the epistles were written second. And so we have a chronology here, we have the readings, and we have gender that organize these two chapels. And they each have their own little altar, and you can see, you can light your candles, but you get the same idea here. Look at the sheer amount of painted fabrics, okay, in 3 dimensions over the niches and in the backgrounds. And look at the colors here, the polychromy, it's a word I should have written down there, many colors. And you can see how remarkable all of this is. And I want to talk a little bit about that finally at the end, which is the amount of faux painting you can see at Saint-Xavier, creating the impression of rich materials, richly decorated objects. If we look here, these are the estipites around the high altar. They're carved, and the gold and silver leaf is real. Over here, you have estipites right next to it, but it's paints to give the illusion of that orpiment. It's a yellow kind of paint. So, and this is not something that you typically see in the major churches in Mexico City or around. Here's another example, painted cloth. You can see here, again, the painted curtain, the painted frame. And over here at the high altar, you see this painted faux kind of marbling below that. And this is a slide I wanted to close with to give you another example of what's going on farther south towards Mexico City. But this is in the state of Querétaro. And this is a remarkable, it's a nun's church. And inside you can see, this is a portrait of one of the priests. And you can see he's wearing this beautiful alb here and stole all, the fabrics are just phenomenal. But you can see the painting here in this archway. By the way, what he's doing is giving communion to one of the nuns. Their spaces were completely separated. Painted shield that tells us who he is. But you'll notice here the painted masonry, right? Look what we have at Saint-Xavier, painted masonry. So, so Saint-Xavier has things that put them together in a really remarkable way, but there are many, many patterns of decoration, of course, that come from the existing churches around Mexico City. You can see the painting of the fabric in the dome, and et cetera. Painting of, again, of marbling and stonework. So you look at everything as you go through, look at it not only for the content, the subject matter, but look at the decoration in terms of how clever these things are that may only be painted to kind of inspire in us the idea that these are these other really rich materials and that really give a, make all of this extremely lustrous, and again, give us the idea of this as this whole other world that we step into when we go through the facade. Okay, that's it. Be sure to look at that article by Emily Umberger, and I'll see you in real life on the tour.